Hello and welcome to another edition of Sun Dragon Tips and Tricks. My name is Rebecca. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in downtown Brevard, North Carolina. It's Monday, so I'm here at my house and it's a lovely sunny day outside. I hope some of you are out there enjoying the weather. Today, last week we did some crochet and I said I was going to clarify a little on the crochet. I haven't had any huge outrage over what happened when I was really tired last week. So I do want to get back to crochet, but today I thought we would talk about some knitting and something called the 3-needle bind off. Now Liz said, hey, have you made a video on that? Because Liz has started watching my videos. And I said, maybe we looked and I hadn't. The 3-needle bind off is a really decorative, fun way to bind off when you have two sets of what we call live stitches. So you have two sets of stitches running parallel. Can't really do that with my fingers, like that. And you bind them off. You're going to have a little ridge of V's across the top of it. And if you are going for an invisible bind off with two sets of live stitches, I encourage you to check out my Kitchener stitch bind off video. This one will give you a ridge, but it will be decorative. I think it would be quite nice looking. Looks a little bit like V's. But you also can see the bottom of one stitch. It's hard to explain. It's a bumpy bind off, but it's really pretty if you do it intentionally, like maybe with a third color, but you'll see some of the other colors. I'm hoping when I do it with real yarn, I'm going to use two different colors, not necessarily a third color to bind off, but you can see what happens if you had two colors meeting each other and we're binding off with one of the colors, what you would see when you're done. Anyway, so let's get to it. So here we go. Knitting the 3-needle bind off. Now don't get crazy scared because there are 3 needles involved. You're holding 2 of them in one hand and 1 of them in the other. As I said in the introduction, this is really great when you're finishing off 2 sets of what we call live stitches. That means there's still loops on the needle. But this works when there's 2 sets of them. This works when you're trying to combine 2 different sides of pieces or something that wraps around back to itself, that kind of thing. It's actually very similar to a traditional bind off where you knit 2 stitches and then you lift one over the other and knit another one off of this side, lift one over the other. However, you're going to be combining stitches when you're doing the knitting part from the needles that you're holding in your left hand. So let's walk through the instructions. Let's diagram it. Let's do it. Here are the instructions. My last one went way off. We're going to take a look at that in a second. So first off, you want to hold 2 of the needles that have the stitches on them. The 2 needles with stitches. I'm always adding in notes here, right? With the fabric on it. Parallel to each other. And by parallel, we mean they should be going in the same direction, so their tips are on the same side, and they should be right next to each other. Running parallel, if anyone remembers their high school geometry, means they will not, they won't cross each other. They're running like train tracks. So hold the 2 needles parallel in your left hand. Sometimes when I'm holding them, I will stick a finger in between them to stabilize. If they're right next to each other, this can make it a little bit difficult. My tip on this is separate those needles if we do it with 2 markers. When you're holding them parallel, if you put a finger in between them, I'll show you this with the real needles, but that can leave you space to do what you need to. Okay, step 2, it's something that's going to repeat, so I put a little star here. Your 3rd needle, which you will be holding in your right hand, the 3rd needle goes through the front leg on the end stitches from needle 1 and 2. So the ones that are closest to the end. And they go through knitwise. They go through in the direction that you would do 1 stitch if you were knitting, except you're sticking it through 2 stitches at the same time. Wrap your yarn around the 3rd needle as if you're knitting, because you are, and pull it through both loops back to the front. Once you've done that, you're going to slide the loops just worked off needles 1 and 2, just like knitting. All of these steps are just like a regular knit stitch, except we're working with 2 needles at the same time. You're going to repeat from the star, which is up here. So you're going to do it a second time, and at that point, you will have 2 loops on the right needle, on your 3rd needle. Then it is just like a traditional bind off. You pull the first loop, the one that is further from the needle tip, over the second. The first one that you made is pulled over the second and off. Then you're going to repeat the whole process. Come up here, put your 3rd needle through the front leg of the end stitches on needle 1 and 2, wrap your yarn around, pull it through, slide the loops just worked off needle 1 and 2. You'll have 2 loops. You won't have to repeat it because you'll already have the 2 loops. You'll pull the first loop over the second. So you'll keep repeating until 1 loop remains. And then it's just like fastening off any other bind off. You pull your tail through that last loop to fasten off. So let's diagram it. Let's see what that looks like with some colors added. That might clarify. Remember, if these diagrams don't work for you, everybody's brains work differently. You can skip ahead to when we're doing it with real yarn. But what we have here with step 1 from what I just described with words, we have our 2 needles. We have needle 1, we have needle 2. Over here is needle 3. Needle 1 and 2 are parallel to each other. And if you need to, remember, you can stick a finger in here to keep them spaced apart. It can be really helpful if they're not pressed tight against each other. So we've got the stitches running parallel. The tips are pointed in the same direction. Step 2, inserting needle 3 into the front leg of both stitches. If we take a look up here. Before we do that, let's color code. Let's do this. Let's see. Let's have our front stitch that we're working with will be orange. Let's make the back stitch purple. And if they're on there correctly for most traditional knitting, the right side of this loop is in front. The right side of this loop is in front. Front is what is facing us on these needles. Now down here, needle 3 has gone into the front legs of the stitches that are on needle 1 and needle 2. And knitwise, which means front to back, coming from this direction, front to back. So this guy has pushed in this direction. Let's color code these loops so you can see where they went. There they are. Now the next step will show the end result in the next frame. But the next step is to take your yarn and wrap around this needle the same way you would for a regular knit stitch. You would take your yarn around, English style. You would pick it, continental style. And we're going to duck it back to the front. It's going to look like step 3. Step 3 really is wrapping the yarn and pulling it back to front. For lack of space there, I'm saying pull the yarn back out. If you push in, though, remember with a knit stitch, you're going to pull back out the way you came in. Here's what it's going to look like once we do that. Having pushed in and wrapped around, when you duck it back to the front, and these loops are still on those 2 needles, it's going to stretch things out a little bit if you stop and pause and look here. Let's add in a new color for the working yarn. But take a look, this working yarn has pulled through both strands. So they are connected here instead of just one strand having been pulled back through. You're ducking back under both strands. Step 4, now that we've ducked back under, step 4 was to slide the worked loops. Slide the worked loops off needles 1 and 2. That means the purple one is being slid off and the orange one. They're coming off because they have been worked. They're attached to this guy right now. When they're slid off, they will be connected at the bottom down here. Now we're jumping in this picture because once you do this, you want to repeat it with the next 2 sets of stitches. This guy down here, I'm going to say number 5, we repeat. So here's the first stitch that ended up over on the right needle. If we repeat it, we'll have another stitch. If it helps to think about it, in some ways underneath here, say this is the middle of a bind off, our orange and quite possibly the purple you might see a little bit of, they're down here now. The next set of stitches has happened, so we have 2 over here. If we followed step 5 and repeated all of these steps, I'll bring it down here a little. If we repeat steps 2 through 4, and we have 2 stitches here, then step 6 is to pull your first loop over your second. So this blue one, to finish this bind off before we repeat the whole process, this loop is going to get pulled over. The blue one gets pulled over the green one and off the tip of the needle. It will end up looking like this. When it gets pulled over, it will wrap around this stitch, and the process repeats, so it will end up looking more like these guys back here, and you'll end up with a thicker version of this all along, but it will combine these stitches together and pull stitches over each other to fasten them off. Just in case that got it all confusing, which it might have, let's do it with real yarn. In both needles, wrap the yarn around, pull back through both loops, slide those loops off the needles that are in your left hand. Once you have 2 of them on your right needle, you pull the one further from the tip over the one closer to the tip, and then repeat. Let's check it out. Okay, so I've got my 2 needles. This is actually a butterfly shawl sample that I started knitting, so we may not have the right number of stitches, but this is just for demonstration and to show what happens when you have 2 different colors of yarn. Honestly, these are a little bit different thickness too. Doesn't really matter. But I have my 2 needles parallel. I'm actually going to use a circular needle to bind off. It doesn't matter. Not much is going to stay on this needle. As long as you have enough space for a couple of stitches, you'll be fine. So, needles 1 and 2, and they are pointing in the same direction. They are, for all intents and purposes, parallel. I know it's not perfect, but this is not a perfect world. I have 1 finger between these needles to kind of help me stabilize. And if we take a look, I can try to put them at slightly different higher and lower altitudes here so you can see. These are the 2 stitches that I'm going to be working with first. I'm going to take my needle, I'm going to put it like I'm going to knit in this stitch, but then I'm also going to take it like I'm going to knit through this back stitch. So I've got it through 2 stitches. Get a little slack here. Looks kind of like that picture. If I can find my yarn, I'm going to wrap it around like I'm going to knit, and then I'm going to duck it back under both of these stitches. I can do it one at a time. There's 1. There's 2. If it's hard to do it in one fell swoop, that's fine. But now we can take, these 2 stitches have been worked, so they can come off. 1, 2. They can come off both needles. I have 1 stitch over here. I need 2. So again, I'm going to go knitwise through the first needle and knitwise through the second. See that from the top? I'm going to wrap around and I'm going to duck them back under. 1, 2. I haven't changed the angle so it can come straight back out nice and easy. And I'm going to take these 2 off, if I can squeeze them off. Now I have 2 stitches. I'm going to use one of these needles, maybe the back one's easier, to lift the one that's further away from the tip up and over and off. I have bound off 1 stitch. Now I'm going to repeat the process. In knitwise, first needle, second needle, wrap around, duck back out the way you came in under 1 needle, under the second needle, slide these worked stitches, you might need to slide them up a bit, off. Now I've got, every time you have 2 loops on your right needle, lift the one that's further away from the tip. If you need to, put your finger back here to keep the front one from falling off. Lift the one that's further away over the one that's closer to the tip, and I've got 2 bound off. Let's do that again. Insert knitwise through the front loop. 1, 2, wrap around, duck back out the way you came in under the second and then the first, slip those 2 stitches off, lift the loop that is further away on your right needle over the loop that is closer to the tip. It'll look like a normal bind off, except we'll have a little more going on the back. If this is not going to lay flat like this, like on the front, you can't see much, right? If I put all these a little bit further away from the tip so I can spread this out. There's not that much there to show you yet, but here's what it looks like if this was to lay flat. Say it was a shoulder seam, so this is on top of your shoulder, or say it was going down the back or just part of a cowl. You'll have V's here, but you'll have some bumps back here. It'll all be visible. If you have different colors, they'll interlock. If they're the same color, you'll just see a lot of texture there. So let's get this set back up again. We pick them up so that these 2 needles are running parallel, mostly, to each other. Let's keep binding off. We go in, front loop, do whatever you need to with your hands to keep this from falling off. Wrap around your right needle, duck back out through the second needle, first needle, the way you came in, pull them both off. Further away loop is pulled over the closer loop. I had my finger back here so this loop wouldn't fall off. Now I can start again. Front loop of the front and back needle, wrap around, hold it a little tight if you need to, come back under both of them, slide them both off, use your fingers if you gotta. Fingers are a great way to make sure things don't fall off. Further away loop comes over the closer to the tip loop. I'm going to keep going. Just watch. Slide these up when you need to. Remember, I don't have enough loops here to finish the loops back here. We'll just take a look at what it looks like when at least 1 needle is free. It is awkward, but if you keep a tight hand on everything, and I said keep this a little tighter when it ducks under, but we don't want a super tight bind off. So if you can, use your fingers wherever you need to keep things from falling off. Here's my last one. At least for the front needle. Now in theory, a lot of what you're doing would have an equal number of stitches. So let's see, this guy's done. Let's look at what's happened so far back over here. Remember, if this was my last stitch, I'd pull it, I'd cut this, and I'd pull it through to fasten off. So this is what it looks like once you're done. And guess what? I'm going to pretend these stitches don't exist anymore. Let's take my needle out so we can just see. If this was it right here, here's what we'd see. If you stretch it out, on one side, we're going to have a nice row of V's. On the other side, we're going to have some, what looks like little pearl bumps there, but it's still a pretty attractive texture. You won't have V's on both sides, but you will have a pretty neat looking thing running down the surface of your fabric. So thanks for joining us for the 3-needle bind off. It's a really great way if you have live stitches to bind them off without having to do the crazy Kitchener. If you don't want something visible like this, where your two fabrics come together with those live stitches, like I said, I encourage you to check out the Kitchener sewn bind off, because that will look pretty much invisible. This is if you want to see it, and it can be really cool to be a ridge on your shoulders, down the center of a back if it's something that's knit in. It's a really, if you do it deliberately, embrace the visual bind off, and it can be really fun. I hope you enjoyed this. If you'd like to see anything else, please let me know. If I can, I'll make a video on it. If not, I'll try to comment on your comments. You know, if you haven't already, consider subscribing. You also might want to check out the Dragon Sideshow, where Liz, my assistant at the shop, and I talk about everything we're working on and yarns we have available in the shop. Otherwise, craft on with joy and confidence. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye. Oh, there's the kitty. Yeah.